Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking a really close look at The Hague. It's a city you probably associate with international justice, maybe global order.
Right, the Peace Palace and all that.
Exactly. But right now, it's actually become this intense flashpoint. You've got major geopolitical clashes happening, passionate protests on the streets. It's quite a scene.
Yeah, it really is.
So our deep dive today is all about trying to understand these really complex, multi-layered dynamics. We're looking at the Middle East, the global stage. We've pulled together insights from a whole stack of different sources, legal reports, geopolitical analysis, even opinion polls.
Right. And the goal is to help you connect the dots, really.
Exactly, to grasp the bigger picture beyond the headlines.
Yeah, because our sources, they really unpack this intricate web. You've got the legal battles, these big strategic campaigns trying to shape how everyone sees things, and then the very real impacts of conflicts escalating.
It's a lot to untangle.
It is. So we want to help you, the learner, understand what these different events actually mean when you put them all together.
Okay, let's dive right in then. Starting at the heart of it all, international law in The Hague. It's home to two really critical places.
Right.
The International Court of Justice, the ICJ, that's the UN's main court for state versus state disputes. And then there's the International Criminal Court, the ICC, which goes after individuals.
And both have been incredibly busy lately.
They certainly have.
Focusing on the ICJ first, our sources show a lot happening regarding Israel. There's that ongoing case South Africa brought concerning the Genocide Convention in Gaza.
Right. I saw the deadline for Israel's response got pushed back again.
Yeah, to January 2026.
Yes.
So that tells you these things take time, a long time. But what's maybe even more striking is the engagement around another ICJ action. The advisory opinion on Israel's obligations in the occupied Palestinian territory.
What kind of engagement are we talking about?
Well, 45 written statements were filed. Think about that. And you had major international bodies like the African Union, the League of Arab States, participating in the hearings. It shows just how much global attention is focused there.
Wow. So it's not just a few countries involved.
Not at all. And,
Yeah.
the ICJ docket is full. Generally, there's Lithuania versus Belarus on alleged migrant smuggling, Sudan versus the UAE on the Genocide Convention, too. It's a busy court.
Okay, so the ICJ is handling state disputes, but then you mentioned the ICC, the International Criminal Court. That's different, right? It targets individuals.
Exactly. And that's where we've seen some really significant global controversy recently.
The arrest warrant.
The arrest warrants, yes. The ICC prosecutor sought warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Gallant.
And also Hamas leaders, right?
Correct. Alongside Hamas commander Mohammed Deif, warrants were also previously sought for Yahya Sinwar and Ismail Haniyeh before their death.
And the charges against the Israeli leaders?
Serious ones. Crimes against humanity and war crimes, allegedly committed starting October 8th, 2023. Things like using starvation as a method of warfare, murder, persecution, other inhumane acts.
Okay, and the reaction to that, imagine it was strong.
Extremely strong, especially from the U.S. and Israel. Our sources highlight, for instance, Ted Deutsch, the CEO of the American Jewish Committee.
What did he say?
He called it a distortion of justice, morality, and international law, basically arguing it was driven by anti-Israel animus and wrongly equated democratic leaders with a terror group.
And that sentiment was shared in the U.S. government.
Oh yeah, bipartisan outrage. The Biden administration voiced deep concern about the prosecutor, quote, rushing to seek arrest warrants, and mentioned troubling process errors.
In Congress.
Very vocal. Representative Mike Waltz, who's expected to be Trump's national security advisor, he posted on X that the ICC has no credibility and claimed the allegations were refuted by the U.S. government itself.
So, strong words.
Very. And Senator John Thune, the incoming Senate Majority Leader, called the decision outrageous and unlawful. He even suggested the Senate should look at sanctions legislation against the ICC.
It's crucial context, though, that neither Israel nor the U.S. are actually members of the ICC, right?
That's a key point. Our sources mention Israel specifically declined to join way back, partly over concerns the statute could be, let's say, twisted to target Israelis for actions in the West Bank.
And Israel's counter-argument to the warrants often involves its own legal system.
Exactly. They point to having an independent judiciary that investigates alleged crimes. Sources mention, dozens of criminal investigations opened by the military advocate general, hundreds of incidents looked at by their internal fact-finding mechanism.
So they argued that the ICC lacks jurisdiction or necessity because they handle it internally.
That's the core of their argument, yeah. But globally, The reaction was really mixed.
How so?
Well, you had countries like Argentina, Paraguay, Austria, Estonia, Hungary, the Czech Republic expressing skepticism or outright condemnation. But then the EU's High Representative, Josep Borrell, he embraced the decision, stressing accountability. So, quite divided.
It really feels like these court actions are becoming more than just legal procedures. They're almost a battleground for legitimacy itself.
That's a good way to put it. A battleground for legitimacy and how global justice is perceived.
And within that charged atmosphere, our sources point to another interesting element, this concept they call the Red-Green Alliance. What exactly is that?
Yeah, it's a term used in some of our sources to describe what they see as a collaboration.
Yeah.
Specifically between radical left activists and political Islam activists, sometimes called Islamists.
Collaborating where?
In civil society, in public spaces in the West, and importantly here, including in the legal sphere. And the sources suggest this isn't new. It's been developing for over 2 decades.
Okay, that's fascinating. And how does this supposed alliance connect directly to the legal actions at The Hague that we've been talking about?
Well, the sources provide some pretty specific examples. They identify 3 advisors to the prosecution in these cases.
Advisors to the ICC prosecution.
Yes. And these sources state they are members of organizations affiliated with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP.
The PFLP. Remind us.
It's a group with a complex history, often linked in these sources and elsewhere to international terrorism. So the affiliation itself is highlighted as controversial.
Like, who are these individuals?
Issam Yunus from Al-Mazan, Raji Sourani from the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, and Shawan Jabrin from Al-Haq. The sources also note that Sourani and Jabrin held senior roles at FIDH, the International Federation for Human Rights, which is a major NGO based in France.
Okay, so links between prosecution advisors and PFLP-affiliated groups. Any other examples?
Yes, another one involves the Euromed Monitor, based in Geneva. Its founder, Rami Abdou, was actually defined back in 2013 in Israel as a Hamas operative in Europe.
And what did Euromed do?
According to these reports, they claimed they submitted detailed documents to the ICC prosecution and the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. They also publicly called for an investigation into Israel for alleged organ harvesting, a claim that also got traction with some online influencers.
Organ harvesting. That sounds like a very serious and potentially inflammatory accusation.
It is. And then there's Dawn, Democracy for the Arab World Now, an Islamist American organization, the sources say. Nihad Awad, who's the CEO of CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, sits on its board.
And their involvement.
They signed a petition supporting the lawsuit against Israel and apparently submitted a list of 40 Israeli military officers to the ICC, alleging involvement in the Gaza campaign.
So the picture painted by these sources is one of a network of civil society groups actively working within the legal system.
Yes, characterized by these sources as part of a multidimensional campaign aimed at undermining Israel's international legitimacy.
It does raise a tricky question, though, doesn't it? How do you differentiate, based on this material, between, say, a legitimate human rights campaign using legal tools and something that might be more strategically driven or, as these sources imply, part of a broader political agenda?
That's the million-dollar question when you're analyzing these things, right? It's often not clear-cut.
Especially when you bring Iran into the picture. Let's unpack their stated policy because that seems relevant context here.
Absolutely crucial context. Iran's position since the 1979 revolution has been consistently aimed at Israel's elimination. That's according to numerous sources analyzing their rhetoric and actions.
Ayatollah Khomeini called Israel the small Satan, didn't he?
He did, alongside the U.S. as the great Satan. And that kind of rhetoric hasn't really faded. Our sources point to leader after leader, Khamenei, Rouhani, Raisi, military commanders like Salami and Fadavi, consistently calling for Israel's destruction, using phrases like, wipe off the map.
And there's Quds Day, too.
Right, the annual Quds Day, established by Khomeini, is a major event used to promote Muslim solidarity against Israel. And the slogan, Death to Israel, or Marg Bar Esrael, is, well, commonplace in those contexts.
And this isn't just rhetoric, is it? There's action, too.
Definitely. It's directly linked to Iran's documented support for groups like Hezbollah, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hamas, the Houthis. Our sources frame all of this, the rhetoric, the events, the proxy support, as part of that same multidimensional campaign to undermine Israel's international legitimacy.
So it's clear these legal and political fronts are deeply intertwined. How is this playing out now, especially with tensions escalating so dramatically?
Well, it's escalated beyond campaigns and rhetoric into direct conflict. Our sources state that on June 13th, 2025, so very recently, Israel launched strikes against Iranian nuclear and military targets.
And that was right after the IAEA finding.
The very next day. The International Atomic Energy Agency declared Iran was in breach of its non-proliferation obligations, and then came the Israeli strikes. Sources are calling it the start of a war between them.
And we're seeing the immediate fallout already.
We are.
Economically, I saw reports that Turkish lira is under renewed pressure because of the attack. Airlines are canceling flights left and right to Iran, Iraq, Jordan due to the bombing. And even today, June 22nd, there are protests happening right back where we started in The Hague. Hundreds protesting against NATO, military spending, and this specific Israel-Iran conflict, literally hours after the U.S. apparently targeted Iranian nuclear sites again.
It's incredibly tense. And what's really striking, looking at the broader picture in our sources, is how this isn't just an isolated regional conflict. It's becoming a flashpoint in a much larger global reordering.
How so? You mean other major powers getting involved?
Exactly. They're not just watching. They seem to be actively using these crises. Take China. Sources like the INSS's Israel-China Policy Center note its growing presence in Central Asia, its economic clout. It's becoming a bigger factor in Israel's own strategic thinking.
And
Russia's very active, too. Its state atomic energy company, Rosatom, is backing nuclear projects in Africa, expanding influence there. But also, closer to Europe, sources suggest Russia is stirring up conflict in the Western Balkans, potentially as, quote, leverage against the West.
And they've issued some pretty stark warnings related to Iran.
Yes. Warnings of World War III after the U.S. strikes on Iran, and also warnings of a potential refugee crisis if, as they claim, Western powers pursue regime change in Iran. So they're deeply involved in the narrative war, too.
This really shows how interconnected everything is, and these big geopolitical shifts, they don't just happen at the government level. They filter down, right? They shape public opinion, even within allied countries.
Absolutely. And Bulgaria is a fascinating case study for that, based on one of our sources.
What did the poll there show?
It's quite revealing. Nearly 40% of Bulgarians apparently want out of NATO now. Anti-NATO feeling is rising, and the source attributes this to stronger than ever pro-Russian and anti-Western propaganda.
40% in a NATO country, that's significant.
It is. And get this. Over half, 57%, don't see Russia as a security threat anymore. 30% actually see Russia as their most important strategic partner. This is despite the invasion of Ukraine.
Wow. So the narrative war is having real impact.
Seems so. Bulgaria's Deputy Defense Minister, Jordan Buzilov, is quoted talking about a hybrid propaganda war for Bulgarian minds, and he says the enemy in that war is stronger, especially using social media. It shows a major shift in public perception within a NATO member state.
That is a profound shift. Okay, so bringing it all together, you have these intense geopolitical currents, shifting public opinion. How does this influence protest movements like the ones we're seeing? And crucially, what makes them effective or ineffective? Because it feels like protests always face this dilemma.
That's right. The source material really highlights that tension. Protests are often either ridiculed for being pointless and ineffective, or they're vilified for being too disruptive or criminal. It's hard to win, perception-wise.
So how do modern protests compare to, say, historical ones that are often held up as successful?
Well, sources often contrast today's movements with someone like Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement. Those are described as extremely deliberate, really carefully planned for maximum impact.
How so?
They emphasize strict nonviolence. There was the focus on dignity. Participants often wore their Sunday best, and there was an acceptance of consequences, like arrests, precisely to highlight the injustice of the laws they were breaking. The goals were very concrete. Desegregate buses by making the segregated system financially unviable, shut down discriminatory lunch counters, show massive public support.
And the criticism of modern protests.
Some sources critique them as potentially being more like performative activism, maybe lacking constructive follow-up, or seeming designed primarily to try their hardest to make the news.
That criticism comes up a lot with the campus protests, doesn't it? Targeting universities.
It does. One argument you see is that they're ineffective because they mostly inconvenience fellow students, not the actual decision makers in, say, Washington or Tel Aviv. And also that sometimes bad faith actors, the example given is a spokesman saying Zionists don't deserve to live, can hijack the message and alienate people.
But there's a counter-argument too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The counter-argument is that these protests do have clear goals, like getting universities to divest from certain companies, similar to the anti-apartheid movement targeting South Africa back in the day. And proponents argue that protests should be uncomfortable, they should be inconvenient. That's how you challenge an unacceptable status quo.
So this really gets to that crucial difference one source mentioned, the difference between drawing attention to the issue and drawing attention to the protesters themselves.
Exactly. That seemed to be a key factor in perceived effectiveness. Based on synthesizing the sources, a few things stand out for what makes a protest work.
Like what?
Having clear, concrete, and achievable objectives is one. Targeting the actual institutions and people responsible for the problem, rather than just disrupting random people's lives by, say, blocking roads, which can backfire. There's also the challenge of messaging and how it's interpreted. The slogan, "From the river to the sea," for instance. Whatever its intended meaning, sources point out it's often heard, especially by older people who remember decades of conflict, as a direct call for Israel's destruction. That perception matters.
And the media's role?
Crucial. One perspective raised is that if corporate media opposes the protest's politics, it might, quote, obfuscate the political environment with misinformation, basically shaping the narrative against the protesters.
So many factors at play. Is there any consensus in the sources on what would lead to change regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict specifically?
Well, one viewpoint expressed is that Israel is the only true democracy in the Middle East, and therefore fundamental change regarding its policies, like those pursued by Netanyahu, would ultimately have to come from within Israel itself. It'll take the Israeli people ousting Netanyahu to really change anything. That's one perspective offered.
Okay. So we've covered a lot of ground here. What does this all mean for us, just trying to make sense of everything that's happening? Today, we've navigated through the very complex legal world of The Hague. We've explored these strategic campaigns trying to shape international legitimacy. We've seen the real-world impacts of the escalating conflicts and looked into the dynamics of protest in today's world.
And what's really fascinating, I think, when you connect all these threads from the sources is just how interconnected it all is. You know, the legal fights, the information wars, the shifting alliances, the street protests, they aren't separate things. They all feed into and reflect this larger global struggle for influence, for power, for how we even define justice.
Right. It goes way beyond the daily headlines.
Exactly. Understanding these different layers, these different perspectives presented in the sources helps us get a much richer, more nuanced picture of what's actually going on.
So as you, our listeners, reflect on this deep dive, maybe consider this. In a world just flooded with information, but where real clarity feels scarce sometimes, how do you personally sort through it all? How do you try to figure out the real motivations behind global events? And maybe what role do you think individual actions or these big international bodies like the courts truly play in shaping what happens next?
Yeah, those are the big questions. And the answers, well, as always, they probably require digging even deeper into the sources yourself.